The bikers entered a roadside cafe, confident that here they could do whatever they wanted. They brazenly harassed the waitress, not realizing that Chuck Norris was watching them closely. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching this video from. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, a rhythmic drumming against the windows of the small roadside diner. The neon "Open" sign flickered erratically, struggling to fight against the darkness of the desolate highway. The few cars that passed by barely slowed, their headlights sweeping over the empty parking lot before vanishing into the void. Inside, the warmth of the diner provided a stark contrast to the cold, wet night outside. The place was quiet, save for the soft crackle of an old radio playing a blues tune from the corner. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the lingering aroma of grilled burgers and frying oil. It was a scene of late-night routine. Empty booths with cracked leather seats, laminated menus smeared with fingerprints, and a few lonely patrons nursing their drinks in silence. Lily wiped down the counter with slow, practiced movements. Her shift was almost over, but the exhaustion had settled deep into her bones. She had worked at the diner long enough to know that nights like this, empty, uneventful, and drowned in the scent of cheap coffee, were rare. Something about the silence felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. She glanced at the old clock hanging above the register. Another hour. Just another hour and she could leave, go home, and pretend for a little while that she wasn't stuck in this nowhere town, waiting tables for customers who barely saw her as a person. A pair of truckers sat at one of the booths near the window, their voices low and hushed. One of them was older, his thick beard speckled with gray, his hands rough from years on the road. The younger one scrolled through his phone, occasionally glancing up at his companion. They had been here for a while, stopping in for a quick meal before heading back out onto the highway. In the farthest corner of the diner, away from the fluorescent lights and the hum of the coffee machine, sat a man. He was quiet, almost blending into the surroundings, but there was something about him that made Lily take notice. He wore a simple leather jacket, a cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes, his face lined with the kind of experience that told 1,000 untold stories. He had been there for some time, sipping his coffee slowly, his presence almost unnoticed by the others. Unlike the truckers, unlike the occasional traveler stopping in for a quick bite, he seemed still, as if he belonged there in a way no one else did. Lily refilled the coffee pot, glancing at him again. Something about him felt familiar, but she couldn't place it. Maybe he was just another drifter, someone passing through, searching for a moment of peace before moving on. The soft chime of the diner's doorbell suddenly shattered the quiet. A blast of cold air swept in as the door swung open, bringing with it the scent of cigarettes, leather, and rain-soaked asphalt. 5 men stepped inside. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The quiet hum of conversation from the truckers ceased. The warmth of the diner seemed to recede, replaced by something colder, heavier. They moved with the arrogance of men who knew they owned the space they walked into. Leather jackets adorned with faded patches, heavy boots leaving muddy prints on the tile floor, the smell of motor oil and whiskey clinging to them like a second skin. Lily felt it the moment their eyes found her. The leader, a stocky man with greasy hair and a scar stretching across his cheek, grinned. Well, well. His voice was low, almost a purr, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. He didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. His presence alone was enough to command attention. Lily swallowed, gripping the coffee pot a little tighter. She had seen men like this before. They came in late, loud and overconfident, expecting everything to be handed to them. Most were content with food and booze, leaving nothing but dirty dishes and crude jokes in their wake. But these men weren't here for food. The leader, Roy, she remembered now, leaned against the counter, his grin widening. "Still working the graveyard shift, sweetheart?" The way he said it made her skin crawl. Lily forced a polite smile, the kind she had mastered over the years. "Stay calm. Stay professional. Don't give them a reason." "Coffee?" she asked, her voice steady. Roy chuckled, exchanging glances with his crew. The man beside him, a lanky figure with a chipped tooth and eyes that held too much malice, whistled low. "She's still got that mouth on her," he mused. Lily tensed but kept her expression neutral. She had dealt with worse. She could handle this. The truckers at the booth remained silent. One of them shifted uncomfortably, but neither spoke up. It was the same every time. No one wanted trouble. Roy tapped the counter twice. "We'll take a round," he said, his tone light but his gaze heavy. Lily nodded, turning to prepare the coffee. She could feel their eyes on her as she moved, the weight of their presence pressing against her like a physical force. She set the cups in front of them, avoiding eye contact as best as she could. Just get through it. Just serve them and let them leave. Roy wrapped his fingers around the mug but didn't drink. Instead, he leaned closer, his breath warm against her skin. "You always this quiet, sweetheart?" Lily didn't flinch, though every instinct screamed at her to step back. "I'm working," she said simply. Roy grinned. "You work too hard. Maybe you need a little break." The chip-toothed man chuckled, taking a slow sip of his coffee. Another of them, this one with a tattoo snaking up his neck, rested an arm against the counter, deliberately blocking her path. Lily's pulse quickened. Roy reached out, his fingers brushing against her wrist, his touch lingering. She pulled back, but his grip tightened. The room went still. Lily's stomach twisted into a knot. This wasn't just some casual flirtation. This was something else, something worse. She forced herself to stay calm, to measure her response carefully. If she pushed too hard, it would escalate. If she didn't push at all, it would be worse. But before she could say or do anything, another sound cut through the tension. A chair scraping against the tile floor. It was slow, deliberate, and everyone turned to look. In the corner of the diner, the man with the cowboy hat stood up. He moved without hurry, his presence somehow heavier than all 5 of the bikers combined. The way he adjusted his hat, the way he took a single step forward, it wasn't just movement, it was a warning. And, for the first time that night, Roy's smirk faltered. The air inside the diner grew thick, the once casual atmosphere replaced by something raw and dangerous. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with an unspoken challenge. The truckers remained still in their seats, their gazes lowered to their coffee mugs as if pretending not to notice the growing tension. Lily stood frozen behind the counter, her pulse hammering in her throat, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. She had been in uncomfortable situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just unwanted attention or drunken flirting. This was ownership. Roy and his men weren't just passing through. They believed this place, this moment, belonged to them. Roy's fingers still lingered around her wrist, his grip not yet forceful but firm enough to make it clear that he expected her not to move. His breath smelled of whiskey, and his grin was that of a man who enjoyed control. He tilted his head slightly, his expression one of amused curiosity, as if he were testing how far he could push before she broke. You always this stiff, sweetheart?" His voice was smooth, deliberate. His fingers curled tighter for a fraction of a second before finally releasing her. But the message had been sent. He had let her go on his own terms. Lily stepped back subtly, putting just a little more space between them, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. The others were watching, their expressions ranging from casual amusement to something darker. The man with the chipped tooth, Greg, chuckled lowly, drumming his fingers against the counter. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes flicking over her with undisguised interest. "She's got a little fire in her, huh?" He exhaled slowly through his nose, as if savoring the moment. "I like that." Another one of them, the one with the tattoo crawling up his neck, smirked as he reached for the sugar packet holder and deliberately knocked it to the floor. "Oops," he muttered, feigning innocence. "Think you could grab that for me, doll?" Lily's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to maintain the same neutral expression. She'd been through this dance before. Play along just enough to keep things from escalating. Don't push too hard. Don't make them feel like they're losing control. But deep down, she knew that strategy wouldn't work tonight. These men weren't here to play. She moved cautiously, bending down to retrieve the fallen packet. She felt them watching, their gazes lingering where they shouldn't. When she straightened, Roy was still smirking, watching her like a cat watches a mouse. "You always been such a good girl?" he asked, tilting his head. Lily didn't answer. She turned, pretending to focus on wiping down the counter, but she could feel him moving closer. Her breath hitched when she felt the heat of him just behind her, his presence wrapping around her like a trap. He reached out, his fingers grazing the hem of her apron just barely, as if testing boundaries she already knew he had no intention of respecting. "You ever think about getting out of here?" Roy murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "A girl like you, all alone in a place like this, it ain't safe." His fingers caught the edge of her apron, tugging lightly. Lily swallowed, but before she could respond, the quiet scrape of a chair being pushed back echoed through the diner. It wasn't loud, not abrupt, but it sliced through the tension like a blade. Roy's movements stilled. His fingers uncurled, his posture stiffened just slightly. Slowly, he turned his head toward the source of the noise. The man in the cowboy hat had stood up. He moved with a deliberate ease, his motions fluid, unhurried. He adjusted his jacket slightly, rolling one shoulder as if shaking off a long day's fatigue. Then he took a single step forward. The effect was immediate. The entire dynamic of the room shifted. The truckers, who had been doing their best to remain invisible, finally lifted their heads, their eyes darting between the cowboy and the gang. Even the music from the crackling radio seemed to have faded into the background. Lily's breath caught in her throat. Roy's smirk returned, but it was different now, less assured, more calculating. "And what's your story, old man?" he asked, his voice still casual, but there was a subtle edge to it now, a hint of wariness. The man didn't answer immediately. He simply stood there, his presence alone commanding attention. His eyes, steel blue, sharp and unwavering, locked onto Roy's. No hesitation, no fear. Greg shifted uncomfortably on his stool. "He ain't saying much, is he?" Roy exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly as if dismissing whatever thought had just crossed his mind. He turned his full attention back to Lily, as if she were the safer choice. He reached out again, brushing his knuckles lightly along the side of her arm. "You don't need to be afraid of us, sweetheart," he said, his voice smooth, almost reassuring, as if he actually believed his own lie. "We're just having a little fun." The moment his hand made contact, the man in the cowboy hat moved. It happened so fast that, for a split second, no one understood what they were seeing. 1 second, Roy was standing there, looking amused, in complete control. The next, his wrist was caught in an iron grip, his entire body locked in place by a force far stronger than he had expected. His smirk flickered, just for a second, before turning into a grimace. The cowboy's grip tightened. Roy exhaled sharply, instinctively trying to yank his arm back, but he couldn't. It was like trying to move a mountain. The cowboy hadn't even changed his stance. He was still standing perfectly still, his shoulders relaxed, his other hand resting casually at his side. But his fingers were unmoving, unrelenting, unforgiving. Greg blinked. Let go of me, old man," Roy snapped, his voice suddenly lacking the playfulness from before. The cowboy finally spoke, his voice quiet, calm, but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "I think you've had enough fun." Roy's expression twisted in irritation. He wrenched at his arm again, harder this time, but the cowboy didn't let go. Instead, his grip tightened, just enough for Roy to feel it. Something shifted in the air. The other bikers were still now, their earlier arrogance giving way to uncertainty. They had picked the wrong place, the wrong night, and, most importantly, the wrong man. Roy gritted his teeth as the pressure around his wrist increased, his skin turning red under the cowboy's vice-like grip. His bravado faltered for a split second, just enough for the amusement in his eyes to wane. He tried to pull his arm back again, this time with more force, but it was no use. It was as if his wrist had been locked in a steel trap. The realization hit him hard. This man, this quiet, unassuming man in a cowboy hat, wasn't just some passerby. The diner was still. The truckers at the booth didn't move, their eyes darting between Roy and the cowboy. The other bikers remained seated, their previous amusement now replaced with uncertainty. Even the radio seemed quieter, the blues tune crackling under the weight of the moment. Roy let out a forced chuckle, though it lacked its earlier confidence. "All right, old man," he muttered, his voice lower now. "You made your point. You can let go." The cowboy tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. He didn't release his grip. Lily stood frozen behind the counter, her breath shallow, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She had seen plenty of troublemakers before, men who thought they owned the world because they rode in on motorcycles or carried weapons they barely knew how to use. But she had never seen a man like this. He was calm, unnervingly so, and yet the power in him was undeniable. Roy, feeling his pride on the line, finally snapped. With his free hand, he swung at the cowboy, aiming a solid punch toward his jaw. But he never made contact. With lightning speed, the cowboy released Roy's wrist, sidestepped his punch with effortless precision, and in the same motion, grabbed him by the back of his jacket. In one swift movement, he yanked Roy forward, using his own momentum against him, and slammed him face first into the counter. The impact sent a jarring thud through the diner, rattling the plates and glasses on the surface. Roy let out a pained grunt, his nose colliding with the hard surface. He stumbled backward, his hands clutching his face as blood dripped between his fingers. Silence. The entire diner held its breath. Greg was the first to move, shoving his stool back as he stood abruptly. His chipped tooth was bared in a snarl, and his hand went straight to his belt, where a folding knife was clipped. "That was a mistake, old man," he growled, pulling the blade free with a snapping sound as he flicked it open. Lily's stomach lurched. She had seen fights before, sure, but this was different. She had never seen anyone pull a knife in her diner. The cowboy, however, remained completely unshaken. His stance didn't change. His eyes flickered to the blade, then back to Greg's face, as if assessing whether this was even worth his time. Greg didn't wait for an invitation. With a low snarl, he lunged forward, slashing at the cowboy's midsection. He never made it. The cowboy moved so fast that it was impossible to follow. One moment, Greg was mid-swing, his knife cutting through the air, and the next, his wrist was caught. Not just caught, trapped. The cowboy twisted Greg's wrist so sharply that the knife tumbled from his grasp, clattering onto the tile floor. Greg let out a choked cry, his body forced downward as his own arm was bent at an unnatural angle. Then, without hesitation, the cowboy drove his knee into Greg's stomach, sending him sprawling backward into a table. The wooden surface cracked under the impact, silverware and plates scattering as Greg collapsed onto the floor, groaning. The other bikers finally reacted. The one with the neck tattoo shot up from his seat, grabbing a chair in both hands and swinging it like a weapon. But before he could bring it down, the cowboy ducked, spun on his heel, and drove an elbow into the biker's ribs. The man gasped sharply, staggering as the air was knocked from his lungs. Before he could recover, the cowboy grabbed him by the collar, twisted, and hurled him bodily into the nearest booth. The impact sent ketchup bottles and napkin holders flying. Now, the last two bikers were on their feet. The bearded one with a thick frame cracked his knuckles, bracing himself, while the smallest of them hesitated, eyes darting between the cowboy and his already fallen friends. Roy, still holding his bleeding nose, growled in rage. "Take him down," he shouted. The bearded biker charged. He was fast for his size, his arms swinging as he aimed a brutal punch straight at the cowboy's jaw. It never landed. With an almost lazy grace, the cowboy sidestepped the punch and drove a devastating sidekick into the biker's knee. A sickening pop echoed through the diner as the joint buckled the wrong way. The biker let out a howling scream and collapsed to the ground, clutching his ruined leg. The final man, the last one standing, looked around at the wreckage. His gang, the same gang that had terrorized this town, was on the floor, moaning in pain, some barely conscious. The cowboy hadn't even broken a sweat. And then the realization hit him. His hands shook. He took a step back. Roy, still trying to catch his breath, looked at the cowboy with pure rage. "You don't know who the hell we are," he spat, wiping blood from his face. "We own this town. You think this is over?" The cowboy stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. "No," he said, his voice as calm as ever. "I think you're over." Roy hesitated, something flickering in his eyes, something that almost looked like fear. The cowboy didn't say another word. He simply turned his back on him as if Roy wasn't even worth his attention. The final biker, seeing his chance, bolted for the door, practically tripping over himself in his rush to escape. Greg groaned from where he lay on the floor, still cradling his injured arm. The bearded one whimpered, rocking slightly. Roy stayed where he was, seething, his face contorted in pure humiliation. The cowboy walked back to his table, picked up his coffee, and took a sip. Lily, still behind the counter, couldn't move. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Roy was panting, his hands shaking as he reached into his jacket pocket. Lily saw the glint of brass before it was too late. Brass knuckles. Her stomach dropped. Roy lunged forward, swinging his fist at the cowboy's head with everything he had. The cowboy didn't even flinch. He ducked at the last second, grabbed Roy by the wrist mid-swing, and, with effortless power, hoisted him off the ground and slammed him onto the counter. The entire wooden surface cracked from the force. Roy let out a gasping choke, then he didn't move, The diner was silent. Lily exhaled shakily. The cowboy set his coffee down. "You're done here," he said simply. Outside, the sound of sirens finally filled the night air. The moment the sirens cut through the rain-soaked night, a shift rippled through the diner. The harsh wail of approaching police cars blended with the hum of neon lights and the low murmur of the jukebox's dying tune. The room was a wreck. Chairs overturned, broken plates scattered across the floor, and 5 battered bikers groaning in pain. The scent of spilled coffee mixed with the acrid tang of sweat and blood. Lily barely registered the flashing red and blue lights outside. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the counter, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. Her world had been spinning from the moment Roy and his gang walked in, but now it had stopped. And all that remained was the sound of 5 men lying broken at the feet of the man in the cowboy hat. Chuck Norris stood calmly, his expression unreadable, as if nothing unusual had happened. His knuckles weren't bruised, his breathing remained steady, and not a single bead of sweat lined his forehead. The only thing that changed was the faint tilt of his head as he watched Roy groan on the counter, barely conscious. A heavy, uneven breath rattled out of the gang leader's throat. He shifted slightly, his fingers twitching as he tried to push himself up, but the pain was too much. His broken nose still bled freely, staining the counter beneath him. His ribs ached from where he had been slammed down, and his vision was blurred, the last few seconds of the fight replaying in his mind. He had never lost like this. Never. But this man? Who the hell was this man? The door swung open with force, and 2 uniformed officers stormed in, hands on their holsters, scanning the chaos before them. Their eyes widened as they took in the sight. 5 known troublemakers sprawled across the floor, battered beyond recognition, while the rest of the diner remained untouched. One of the officers, an older man with graying hair and a sharp, assessing gaze, let out a low whistle. His name tag read Sergeant Michaels. Well, he muttered, shaking his head as he stepped further inside. If it ain't Roy Dawson and his boys. His tone carried neither surprise nor amusement, just the tired indifference of a man who had seen this before. The younger officer at his side nudged his chin toward the counter. Jesus, they got messed up bad. Michaels barely spared him a glance. He had already seen the wreckage, the broken bodies, and the single man standing in the middle of it all, unscathed. His sharp eyes landed on Chuck Norris. He studied him for a long moment. Then recognition clicked. "Aw, hell," Michaels exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "It's you." Chuck didn't respond. He didn't have to. Michaels let out another sigh, shaking his head as he gestured to his partner. "Call it in. Assault, property damage, and extortion. We're taking them all in." The younger officer hesitated. He eyed the bikers, then Chuck, his lips parting slightly as if he wanted to say something. But then he just nodded, stepping back outside to radio it in. Meanwhile, Michaels turned to Lily. "You okay?" His voice wasn't unkind, but it carried the weight of someone who had asked this question too many times before. Lily blinked, as if finally snapping out of the haze she had been trapped in. She looked down at her shaking hands, then at the broken plates littering the floor. She felt like she should be more afraid, that she should be trembling in shock. But instead, she felt something else entirely, a strange, unfamiliar sense of relief. She exhaled sharply. "Yeah," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I think I am." Michaels gave a nod, then glanced back at Roy, who was still trying and failing to push himself upright. "They giving you trouble again?" Lily's fingers curled into her palm. "They came in looking for money," she admitted, threatened me, said if I didn't pay, they'd start making things difficult. Michaels sighed heavily, like a man who had been expecting this answer. Figures. We've had complaints about these guys for months, but no one wanted to press charges. Well, I do, Lily said, the words coming out before she could second-guess them. A sharp, bitter chuckle broke through the air. Roy, still bleeding and barely upright, laughed. It was weak, ragged, but filled with defiance. His bloodied lips twisted into a smirk as he finally forced himself into a sitting position, his bruised fingers wiping at his swollen face. "You think this is over?" His voice was hoarse, but there was an unmistakable threat woven into it. "I got people, and they don't like it when one of their own gets locked up." Michaels rolled his eyes. Yeah, you've got people, I've got paperwork, big deal." But Roy wasn't looking at Michaels anymore. He was looking directly at Chuck Norris. "You made a mistake, old man," he spat, his voice thick with fury. "You don't know who you're messing with." Chuck tilted his head slightly, as if considering this. Then he stepped forward. The movement was slow, unhurried, but it carried weight. Even sitting down, even injured, Roy flinched. It was subtle, but it was there. A brief moment of hesitation, of doubt, of pure instinctive fear. Chuck leaned down slightly, just enough that his voice was low, controlled, but impossible to ignore. "This is over." 3 words, that was all. And yet, Roy swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he fought against the very real, very human urge to run. Michaels, watching the exchange, let out a quiet chuckle under his breath. "You know," he muttered, "this might be the first time I've seen Roy shut up." Chuck straightened, turning back toward his table. The tension in the room eased, though it didn't fully dissipate. The other bikers were still groaning on the floor, their bodies beaten, their pride even worse off. The younger officer finally returned, tucking his radio away. "Units are on the way," he reported. "They'll take these guys in." Michaels nodded, but his gaze flickered toward Chuck once more. "You want to give a statement?" Chuck finally spoke, his voice as calm as ever. "You got video evidence." A pause. Then, from the farthest booth, a new voice chimed in. "Damn right, I do." A trucker, the same one who had been sitting quietly the entire time, held up his phone, and his screen still glowing with the footage he had captured. "I got the whole thing. From the moment they walked in to the moment this guy put them down." Michaels smirked, shaking his head. "Well, that makes my job a hell of a lot easier." Roy gritted his teeth but said nothing. Chuck turned back to his table, picking up his coffee again as if nothing had happened. Lily watched him, something deep inside her shifting. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel afraid. The flashing red and blue lights outside the diner cast long, shifting shadows across the wreckage inside. The steady hum of police radios and the occasional murmured conversation filled the air as the officers moved through the scene, securing the wounded and barely conscious bikers. The younger officer had stepped outside to speak with the dispatch, while Sergeant Michaels remained inside, overseeing the arrests with his usual air of exhausted patience. Lily stood behind the counter, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze flitting between the police and the battered gang members. Her pulse was finally beginning to slow, but the weight in her stomach hadn't lifted. It wasn't just the violence, or the mess, or the fact that she had just watched 5 grown men get systematically dismantled by a single man. It was something deeper, something rawer. For the first time in years, she had seen them lose. She had spent too long feeling trapped under the weight of people like Roy, Men who took what they wanted, knowing no one would stop them. And yet, tonight, she had witnessed something different. Tonight, justice hadn't come from a badge or a court order. It had come swiftly, decisively, from a man who had simply decided that enough was enough. Her gaze drifted toward him. Chuck Norris sat at his booth as if nothing had happened, his coffee cup still resting on the table, untouched since before the fight had started. He didn't look smug or satisfied. He didn't revel in his victory the way most men would have. He simply sat there, his posture as relaxed as it had been all night, as if none of it had mattered. But it did. It mattered more than she could put into words. A heavy groan broke her from her thoughts. Roy was being hauled to his feet, his wrists bound behind his back with thick zip ties. His face was a swollen mess, his nose still oozing blood, his cheek already darkening with bruises. One of the younger officers grunted as Roy jerked against the restraint, his muscles tensing despite the pain racking his body. "This is bullshit," Roy spat, his voice thick and nasally from his broken nose. "You can't do this to us. We were attacked. That freak jumped us." Michaels raised an unimpressed eyebrow, flipping open his notepad. "That so?" Roy's lip curled. "Yeah, check the damn cameras. We didn't do nothing wrong. Actually," a voice cut in from the back of the diner, "I got the whole thing right here." All heads turned towards the trucker in the booth, the same man who had been quietly recording since the moment things had started going south. He held up his phone, the screen still glowing, a video paused mid-frame. Every word, every threat, every move. "Wanna watch?" Roy's mouth snapped shut. Michaels chuckled under his breath and shook his head. "Looks like we won't be needing a statement after all." He nodded to the officer holding Roy's arms. "Get him out of here." Roy snarled, his body tensing as he tried to fight back one last time, but the officer shoved him forward, keeping him off balance. As they dragged him toward the door, he twisted his head toward Lily, his bloodshot eyes locking onto her with pure hatred. "You think this is over?" he hissed. Lily felt her breath hitch, but she refused to flinch. "You're making a mistake, girl," he continued, his voice lower now, more insidious. "You think you're safe? You think this changes anything? You're nothing. Just a scared little bitch in a dead-end diner. And the second I get out..." A single step, that was all it took. Chuck Norris rose from his booth, his movements slow, unhurried, and yet, despite the deliberate pace, the air in the room shifted. Roy shut up instantly. His shoulders tensed, his breath catching in his throat as Chuck closed the distance between them with the quiet, controlled grace of a predator who had already won. When he spoke, his voice was calm, low. "I told you," he said, his tone even yet final. "This is over." For a moment, Roy held his glare, his pride forcing him to resist the instinct that clawed at the back of his mind. But then Chuck took another step forward, just one, and Roy's entire body stiffened. His pupils shrank, his breath grew uneven, and the unmistakable tremor in his arms betrayed him. He believed him. The younger officer gave Roy a hard shove. "Move!" This time he didn't fight. The other bikers were dragged out behind him, some limping, others too dazed to resist. The bearded one with the busted knee could barely stand, his weight sagging between two officers as they escorted him outside. Greg clutched his arm, his fractured wrist still cradled against his chest, his expression blank with shock. As the last of them were shoved into the back of the police cruisers, the heavy doors slamming shut behind them, the diner fell into a strange silence. No one moved. No one spoke. Then a slow ripple of disbelief passed through the room. The trucker, who had recorded everything, let out a low whistle. "Damn," he muttered, shaking his head. "I've seen some crazy shit in my time, but that was something else." The woman at the counter, who had been clutching her purse with white-knuckled fingers since the beginning, exhaled sharply. "They've been running this town like they own it," she murmured, almost to herself, "and no one ever stopped them." Lily swallowed, finally releasing the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Chuck, meanwhile, simply sat back down. He picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, and nodded slightly in approval. Now, finally, the tension broke. The trucker let out a bark of laughter, shaking his head. "Jesus, you should do this full time." Chuck smirked. "I'm retired." Michaels crossed his arms, looking at Lily with something almost akin to respect. "You pressing charges?" Lily hesitated. She had spent years believing that fighting back wouldn't change anything, that standing up would only make things worse, but tonight had proven her wrong. She straightened her shoulders. "Yes," she said. Roy's words still echoed in her head. "You're making a mistake." But, for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. Michaels nodded. "Good call." He pulled a business card from his pocket and slid it across the counter. "If they come back, call me directly." Lily took it, running her thumb over the number printed on the front. "Thanks." Chuck finished his coffee and stood, adjusting his jacket. He gave her a small nod before heading toward the door. Lily, without thinking, called after him. "Wait." He paused, glancing back. Her throat was dry. She wanted to say something, to find the right words to thank him for everything, for stepping in when no one else would, but all she managed was, "Why did you do it?" Chuck studied her for a moment, then he said simply, "Because too many people looked the other way." And with that, he walked out into the rain, disappearing into the night. Lily stood there, staring after him, feeling something inside her shift. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. For the first time in a long time, she knew things were going to change. The diner was quieter than it had been all night, but the silence wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the kind of hush that came from people holding their breath in fear. It was the silence of something ending, of something new beginning. The chaos of the fight was still visible. Overturned chairs, shattered plates on the floor, and a cracked section of the counter where Roy had landed. The jukebox, which had been playing a slow blues tune before everything unraveled, now sat at an odd angle against the wall, its music cut off mid-song. The neon open sign in the window flickered weakly, as if unsure whether it should keep shining. Lily stood behind the counter, her arms wrapped around herself. The police cars had pulled away minutes ago, leaving nothing behind but the damp smell of rain and the lingering tension in the air. The customers who had stayed, the trucker with the video, the woman at the counter, and a few others who had hidden behind booths, slowly began to move again, as if wakened from a long trance. Someone sighed. Someone else let out a low chuckle, shaking their head in disbelief. "Well," the trucker finally muttered, rubbing his jaw, "that was one hell of a show." Lily swallowed, her fingers tightening against her arms. She had spent so long convincing herself that standing up wouldn't change anything, that it was easier, safer, to keep her head down, but tonight had shattered that belief. She had watched Roy and his men terrorize people like her for years, and they had never once been stopped. Not by the police, not by fear, not by common decency. They took what they wanted because they knew they could. Until tonight. She glanced toward the door, half expecting Chuck Norris to still be standing there, but he was gone. Of course he was. He hadn't stuck around for thanks. hadn't waited for recognition. He had done what needed to be done and walked away like it was just another night. A strange mix of emotions churned inside her: relief, disbelief, and something dangerously close to hope. The woman at the counter let out a breath and looked at Lily. "You really think they won't come back?" Lily hesitated. The fear was still there, a whisper in the back of her mind, telling her that this wasn't over. She had spent too long being afraid to believe that one night, one fight, had changed everything. But then she remembered the way Roy flinched when Chuck stepped forward. She remembered the look in his eyes, not just anger, but fear. And for the first time she realized that fear wasn't just something people like her felt. It was something they felt too, and that meant they weren't invincible. "They might," she admitted, "but if they do, I won't be the same person they pushed around before." The woman studied her for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Good." The trucker, still holding his phone, raised an eyebrow. "So," he said, "what do we do with this video?" Lily blinked, glancing at the screen. The footage was paused on a moment that told the entire story. Roy, bleeding, broken, looking up in shock, while Chuck Norris towered over him, untouched. It was the kind of image that people didn't forget. She thought about it. If they posted it, everyone would see. The whole town. Maybe even beyond that. People would see exactly what happened, who the real cowards were, who really ran when things didn't go their way. But more than that, people would see that someone fought back. She had spent too long keeping quiet. "Post it," she said. The trucker grinned. "You got it." He started tapping at his phone, and Lily turned back to the diner. The mess still needed to be cleaned up, the furniture put back in place, the broken glass swept away. There was still so much to do, but for the first time, it didn't feel overwhelming. She grabbed a cloth and started wiping down the counter, her movements slow but steady. She wasn't just cleaning, she was reclaiming something. The bell above the door jingled, and she stiffened out of habit, but when she turned, it wasn't trouble. It was one of the younger cops who had been there earlier, the one who had zip-tied Roy's hands. He walked up to the counter and set a small card down. "In case you need anything," he said, "we're going to keep an eye on things, but just in case." Lily picked up the card, running her thumb over the printed number. It was a small thing, but it meant something. She looked at the officer. "Thanks." He nodded, then turned and walked back out. Lily exhaled and placed the card under the register. She didn't know what was coming next. She didn't know if Roy's people would try to retaliate, if the town would change, or if, by next week, everything would go back to the way it had always been. But she did know one thing. She wasn't alone in this anymore. The people in the diner weren't just scared customers anymore. They had seen what happened. They had witnessed it, felt it. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like the fear that had ruled this place for so long was breaking. She didn't know where Chuck Norris had gone, but she hoped, wherever he was, he knew what he had done. Because tonight, he hadn't just taken down a gang. He had reminded a town what it felt like to fight back. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and check out our other stories. See you in the next one.